So whenever somebody asks me what is the best translation of the Bible, I always say that it's the one that you'll read. And that's a somewhat flippant answer, but I'm serious when I say it. There are some translations that are better than others, and some that I don't like at all. But if you're going to read it, buy it. Most Americans are biblically illiterate. We have more Bibles per capita than any nation on earth, yet most people rarely read it, and even fewer people study it. Even family devotion time, if present in the home, is just simply reading a text. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine, but we should go further. Discuss it. Think about it. Share your thoughts with each other. If you follow a plan to read the Bible in a year, that's great. But do not limit yourself to that and do it every year, perhaps with different translations. Now, if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I have a preference for the King James Version of the Bible. Simply, it's the one that I'm most familiar with. I grew up with it. And if I'm trying to find a passage, it's the one that I know the words to search on my computer. So I'm trying to find a passage about something, I remember those words. However, I'm not King James Version only. It does have its problems. Its problems I'm familiar with, so I know how to work around them, but it does have problems. There's no such thing as a perfect translation, but the King James Version is a good one, especially if you're familiar with it. You can't even translate, I would like a medium sized pan meat lover's pizza and 6 bone-in medium buffalo wings between Mexican and Spanish and American English without having to borrow words from the other language or using extra descriptors. And before anybody says, how can you have faith if you doubt the Bible? I have faith in God. I don't have faith in translators. I don't doubt the Bible. The Bible is self-correcting code, and no foundational doctrines are impacted by the problems. Now, we can figure out the rest, but the foundational stuff is all there. Now, accepting only one translation and nothing else, that's the doctrine of cults. That doctrine is not biblical, and it is used to deceive others. You can take a single English translation and you can successfully argue both sides of a question, even if it's a question that truly does have an either-or answer. For one thing, to read the King James Version, it does help to be able to read Shakespearean English. People are no longer taught that in school. They did a study on the King James Version, and the average reading level to be able to comprehend the King James Version is college level reading skills, and most people don't read that. Now, the translators themselves expected others to improve and update their work. It was translated from a handful of manuscripts. I can't remember exactly how many. It's like 5 or 6 or 7, maybe 8, something like that, that were all recent at the time that it was translated. And the text was missing some of the manuscript parts. So they took the Latin manuscripts, they back translated it into Greek, put that in the text, then translated that into English. And not to mention that Scribner modified the Textus Receptus in 1894 to make it match the King James Version. In other words, the text was missing, back translated, retranslated, then changed to make it match what was already translated. Today we have about 5,800 manuscripts. I think we actually have more than that. The King James Version translators were forced to translate certain passages in a particular way, even if they disagreed with that. And Erasmus, who compiled the Textus Receptus, was forced to insert parts into it that he knew didn't belong. We also know that Rabbi Akiba, around the 2nd century AD, he hated Jesus. And he intentionally altered certain parts of the Old Testament in what would become the Masoretic text in order to obscure the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. And in some places, he modified the text to make the Jews look better. Now, because the Bible is self-correcting code, we know where most of these places are. Now, the Masoretes themselves, they did copy the text almost perfectly. Something I can't remember for sure, but off the top of my head, it's something like 64 letters that were different over several hundred years, which is phenomenal. But what they started with had been intentionally altered. Plus, there are more than 1,000 words that have changed meaning in English since the King James Version was translated. Some of them have been very drastic changes. We'll go over some of those changes in these short little tidbits in the future. But still, the King James Version is my favorite. Here's a new one that I've recently purchased. Don't know if it's blurry there or not. It's Interlead that has a blank page between every page for notes. So every page, you've got a page to write notes, an entire page. Kind of small print, but it's not too bad. I've not had time to put notes into it yet because I've just recently gotten it, but I do most of my note taking on the computer, and I also put them on random pieces of paper that are lying all over my desk, which would really irritate my wife if she came into my office and saw all the little notes everywhere. So, which translation should you get? Well, the King James Version is a masterpiece of literature besides being the words that we've been given about God. God has seen fit to bless this translation for centuries, and it even originally contained the Apocrypha. They took it out at some point. I don't know why. But the King James Version is very literal. It's a formally equivalent translation, and it gives us many doctrinal terms that are in our common usage even today. But it is written in Shakespearean English. Now, a dynamically equivalent translation, which is a thought for thought translation, that takes the meaning and it puts it into common language. It's a lot easier to read, but more difficult to study, especially if you're doing a word study. Examples of this are the NLT and the TEV. Some of them change things to make them match other places. I have a real problem with that, and that could be a problem that leads to false doctrine, but it can't really lead to false foundational doctrine. It's going to be small stuff. But you're better to read that than to not read the Bible at all. Now, one translation that I use frequently that you've seen in these studies, it's the well, it's an optimally equivalent translation. It's somewhere in between the dynamic and the formal equivalent. It straddles the two, and that's the NET Bible, New English Translation. And if you have the money, I highly recommend you buy this one. But if you do it, buy the one with the notes. Now, be aware that there are 60,932 notes in it, and it is very small print. I had to order a magnifying glass so that I can read it whenever I use it to study. I have the version without the notes on my computer, but for the notes, I use a magnifying glass. I'm getting old. Now, the English Standard Version is a formally equivalent translation, so it tends to be very literal. They translate it as it is for the most part, but it does use the Masoretic text, which has its issues, which we're going to go over those in a longer study in the near future on that. The NASB is good. The New Revised Standard Version is great in the Old Testament, and it's pretty good in the New Testament. It does have notes that tell you when there are optional translations of certain passages, so it's a pretty good one too. There's a couple of others that are good. Rotherham's is good and it's very literal. It's a little bit older English, but it's still very good. Now, if you want to read some of the additional biblically approved non-biblical works that are quoted by the New Testament writers, such as the Apocrypha and First Enoch, the ESV, the King James Version, and the New Revised Standard Version all have the Apocrypha. For the Septuagint, if you want to read the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or if you want to read the English translation of it, Brenton's is the traditional one, and it does contain the Apocrypha in the book version of it. Now, it's not in the electronic version. The electronic version is free, but it doesn't contain the Apocrypha, at least not in the older version of eSword that I use. Now, Brenton's is an older English also, but it's not quite Shakespearean English. Once again, though, if you can afford it, get Lexham's Septuagint, which does contain the Apocrypha, as well as these other translations do, and it uses some of the text from the Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, to cross-reference. And of course, get a BDAG if you have the money. That's a Greek lexicon. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Greenwich. I think that's what it is. It's kind of expensive. It's a good one to get. If you have a Strong's, the Strong's is keyed just to the King James Version text, so it can't really be relied upon completely to look at the underlying meaning of the words, but the Strong's numbering system is brilliant. Now, the Englishman's Greek Concordance is reasonable. It's a low-cost alternative to the BDAG. It's not as good as the BDAG, but it's still a very good concordance. And in addition to what's mentioned above, there are other things to study which don't always make themselves apparent in any translation without additional commentary. Some things just simply don't translate. Things like nuances on words, plays on words, verification codes, poetry, things like that. Even definite articles sometimes are added or omitted because they don't make sense in English, but they're vital to the text, and sometimes they're vital to understanding a passage. And when they're in the underlying text, we should be aware of that. And if they're not there, we should be aware of that as well. But whatever Bible you will read, buy that Bible. Read it, study it, but don't stop there. Add to your study, dig into it, eat it, ruminate upon it, and apply it to your life. And as we've been seeing in these studies, all of these things combined can apply to every modern day life in unforeseen ways. We need to be prepared for what's coming. Have a great day.